Kyle, what's up? How you doing? You look great. You look like Steve Jobs almost over there. I think that's actually a hoodie, not a turtleneck.
It
But
is.
the black, and like the workspace is just looking awesome. So yeah, what's going on, man?
I'm embodying my inner creator, Steve Jobs. So I've got the cashmere on today. Going to be doing some building and refactoring of our infrastructure. So you gotta look good, feel good to do good. So
Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, I know. Thursdays you try to do a build day, so we're meeting on Thursday morning, trying to we'll get this thing done, and then I promise I won't bother you this afternoon, most likely.
that yeah, most likely.
Yeah, most likely. So,
Yeah.
but look, I know you've been doing some great work over there. So, I mean, obviously, we have an AWS estate. I think for anybody who hasn't like read between the lines, there, Kyle is an AWS fanboy. He builds a lot of kind of internal. I would kind of think of them like applications or widgets, really,
Yep.
tying some of our various things together. I know you've been doing a lot of work there, refactoring some pieces over the last couple weeks. We were talking earlier this week, and you were like, "Oh yeah, by the way, I saved us like 80% or something." What did you do?
Yeah. So I, originally coming from more of a traditional software development background, my initial instincts when I was building a database was to do SQL or MySQL, but basically more relational type databases. And if you look at some of the NoSQL stuff, and specifically in AWS, that's DynamoDB is their NoSQL database built for large sets of data, but single table. And what we had was, data that we were replicating that essentially was just a single table as it came out and was being put into a relational database. And but because it was, millions of lines of data, like it actually gets pretty expensive relatively um, to store all that. And so ended up taking a look at it, saying, hey, we don't really need to do it this way. Part of the other thing was how we were accessing it, and the systems that needed to had pre-built integrations with AWS's relational databases.
Mhm.
But when we refactored into a NoSQL database and then just built our own kind of connectors and APIs into grabbing that data the way we needed to, and then giving it back to the different applications, ended up saving us about 80%. Because most of the cost of our AWS environment was actually coming from some EC2 stuff, but that was used as a data gateway, and the database itself. Those were our two biggest costs within our AWS environment, and essentially we're going to eliminate both of those, which will save us 80% plus.
Very cool. I mean, look, I mean, we have a relatively small estate, right? Especially compared to like some of the clients we go in and work with. But is that what you've seen as well, even in larger enterprises, that EC2 and some of those pieces are like from a percentage standpoint of their spend, larger percentages? I mean, that's what I've noticed when I've gone in and done this.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's even a saying that you'll hear a lot of times that is uh, data has gravity. So when you talk about stuff with clients and you're doing an initial scoping, you're always trying to figure out like, well, where does your data reside? Because it has quote unquote gravity. Like it's expensive to move around, and that's where a lot of these what originally in a lot of cloud infrastructure they talked about was ingress and egress fees. That's because you were moving data, so it was a way of rethinking about where's your data structure, or where is it hosted, and then how is it even structured, because not all data needs to be in a relational database, right? Like that was kind of the thing with NoSQL, MongoDB, some of these other things that were designed for large, extremely large amounts of data, that allowed you to scale, keep performance, and lower costs. And so that's we kind of looked at it from that perspective.
Very cool. I mean, I think the ingress, egress, and kind of how you move this data around is a whole other conversation that we could get into sometime and probably
Yep.
go into depth. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Very cool, great work there. And I think the kind of piece I would leave on that. A lot of times when we go into clients, we're not always talking to developers to start. Sometimes we're talking to executives. Sometimes we're talking to people in procurement, and they want to talk about AWS savings. It's such a big line item, for a lot of companies. And one of the things that I talk about, I certainly can't execute it on at the level that you can, but one of the things that I talk to them about is almost a reframing. There's fundamentally two ways to save in AWS, and the one that they all want to talk about and come from is how they buy, right? Whether it's reserved instances, negotiating with AWS, etc. Um, the other one, and often the bigger lever, is how you build. So there's really two pieces. There's how you buy and how you build. And yes, you need some expertise to target the how you build one, but that is where that's where the gold is, so to speak. Like if you're not optimizing how you buy, yes, you should do that. But
Yep.
if you really want to go target these areas and drive real savings, I mean, to the tune in our case of 80% savings here over a couple weeks, granted, smaller environment and that sort of things, but it is representative of what we see. You can
Yeah.
save more by targeting the how you build than you can by how you buy. And so, very cool, great work there, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we even saw, and I won't mention their name, but a client of ours that often speaks about it at LinkedIn or on LinkedIn was posting, and they are, a much bigger enterprise level environment. They're doing the same thing, but at scale and still holding that, 70%, 80% savings. So although for us it was, a much smaller thing, I think it still rings true to your point at scale.
Yeah,
So I look at it as both, right? Like you should look at how you buy. That's the low hanging fruit. Easier to do now because you can, those are quicker levers. But to your point, not the long term thing. You've got to do the short term, which is look at how you buy. Long term is look at how you build.
great. Let's wrap this segment and get into the next.
Awesome.
We are talking about AI. We're going to talk about AI, but specifically, I want to talk about AI in the contact center. It's topical in this case for me, at least. I mean, I did a webinar yesterday on it, pretty well attended, mostly geared towards technology leaders. And the goal was really to inform them about what we are seeing in this space, AI in the contact center specifically, and obviously inform them about how we're approaching it and what we're seeing in the market, but also arm them to be able to go and speak with their operations leaders and their contact center leaders, who are also looking at these things. And so it was pretty good. I think really as much as anything, kind of want to recap some of the high points I hit in that with UKG, and then get any of your thoughts on it.
Yeah.
So we'll I will skip hitting all the statistics. Yes, AI is affecting and impacting most areas of the business right now. Having said that, um, our our opinion and our experience right now is telling us that this is kind of the most well-worn path, at least. As far as verifiable use cases that do deliver positive ROI back to the business, specific to contact center. And so, one of the first things I did in that conversation was kind of work to reframe what a contact center is. First and foremost, I mean, traditionally when people hear contact center, they think call center. They think a floor full of people sitting in cubicles taking calls on the phone. Um, that does still exist out there, and AI is applicable in that use case. However, one of the things we talked about is a contact center can really exist in multiple business units inside of the organization. It's anywhere where you're looking to facilitate, high volume sort of touches or contacts and do it in an efficient way. Some some examples of that would potentially fit outside of like that traditional kind of call center setting would be things like an IT help desk, absolutely a contact center. A potentially like in a um, HR environment, especially like with recruiting and doing that sort of thing. Potentially an AP, right? There's some finance type functions where that occurs. Obviously, inside a sales organization, both inbound and outbound, that can exist. So these types of things can really exist across the business. It's not just traditionally in kind of this customer service segment. So we talked about that a little bit. Um, and then talked about kind of the emerging trends that we see. Really, three of them that looking out at 2025 we think are going to play a big role. Um, the first would be essentially as people are working to implement AI, they're also trying to ensure that it has empathy, right? That it's actually able to contextualize the information that is being given to it from consumers, callers, chatters, emailers, right? Whatever channel they're coming in on. Um, and so that's a big piece so that they can actually personalize the response versus if you think some of the early applications here, this wasn't AI, but some of the early places that this happened was like a chat bot that would integrate with a knowledge base. All right. And so you're searching the knowledge base and you're returning links to articles, right? We use HubSpot. And so this was one of the first ways they did it. Was obviously it's much better now, but you would type your question in, and it would return links to articles from a knowledge base, which is really almost a search type function. Um, that was like very early days of this, but now there's additional kind of intelligence there that is overlaid, really in both directions. One, to contextualize the question, potentially even contextualize it directly to the person that you're interacting with. So an example of that would be like, "Hey, I saw you were doing this in our um, on our website. Is that what you're reaching out about?" Um, and then also contextualize the returns from the knowledge base to be specific. And so that's the type of things that we're seeing there. Um, Next would be this kind of hyper personalization across touch points, very similar to the last, but more and more personalization, which will lead to segmentation, or segmentation that's leading to personalization. This is almost a fusion of what we've seen coming out of MarTech over the last 5, 6, 7 years, right? Where CMOs are actually very, very focused on hyper segmentation of their consumers. And the reason marketing is focused on it is for the cross sell, right? For a revenue driving sort of action. So they can predictively determine what are our highest probabilities for cross sell, upsell, retention, that sort of thing. Call centers are focused on it for an efficiency play, but those two are kind of coming together there. And the third is this concept of kind of listening beyond the feedback. So what are people not saying to you, but it's implied in the questions that they are asking or the things that they are the way they're navigating um, whatever interface you're giving them to do it with, right? So it is a lot of if you go back, and we have mostly been in contact center, but I've been exposed to a fair amount of marketing technology over the last few years, and a lot of this stuff is coming from that space, and so it's kind of interesting. The next piece that we really kind of focused on was just the context center AI maturity model. I know I won't redo the whole thing here, but I do think that this one is important. Um, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about this space, they instantly go to, okay, how is AI going to replace the human touch that we are doing? Um, and in the maturity model we're using, it's kind of a five level maturity model, from support to automate to augment to empower to transform. Those are some fancy words, but all that to say, like, this AI replacement of the actual individual talking to or communicating with um, the consumer isn't until really level 4 in the model that we're using. And so part of there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the first is you're allowing guardrails and training and that sort of thing to occur on any of the AI models or AI tools that you're using. So the first step as one that like vast majority of us are aware of and utilize today in some way, shape, or form. It's really just using machine learning and LLMs to transcribe call recordings, and you make them scannable and searchable. If you use Zoom today, and your tenant has this activated, you can get this right. You get these call transcriptions. I'm sure you know vast majority of people are aware of this type of thing. Oftentimes, you also see people who come to meetings and they'll have like read.ai as an add-in. Um, so that sort of thing, right? That's really a level one sort of thing, and like the business value there is like relatively low, but potentially some efficiency gains in a small group setting. Um, the next is actually starting to work on automating things. So you start to use some of the generative and conversational AI tools to actually automate some of your processes. So most often the way we see this is, um, automatically score 100% of the calls. So basically a QA type function, which again is not consumer facing, right? This is internal facing. It's facing toward first and foremost call center supervisors, secondarily to agents. But you're starting to use AI to enable an amount of oversight and management that most call centers really struggle to do. Right, like without this type of tool, very few no call centers essentially are doing 100% QA QM. Right, they're doing essentially spot checks. Right, so they'll say, hey,
Yeah.
I need to check 10% of our calls per quarter or whatever their internal kind of SOP is. Um, but that's kind of a level two. But again, like the guardrails are there because it's internal facing. Um, Level three is really more around starting to make it agent facing. So how it's essentially the next step of a knowledge base, right? So last couple of years, or even last 5-10 years, organizations have done a lot of work to try to compile knowledge bases to have them be easily searchable for their agents when they are on calls with clients to be able to accurately address issues and do it within process and within policy and all of that sort of thing. For organizations that did that and structured it well and put a lot of thought into it, they're actually in a pretty decent spot to move into this area because that all of that is data, and it's data that can be used to train these models. Um, so that is kind of this step three. It's agent augmentation, either via agent input, or you can actually have essentially live transcription of calls and then proactively serving that up to agents. Hey, the caller is saying this, or the person chatting is saying this, the person emailing is saying this. Here's what we think it is. And then you also get this training capability as you dial that in over time with your agents. um, so right now, what we're seeing, not only what we're seeing in our experience, but even like we kind of launched a poll during that podcast and asked, or our webinar rather, and asked people where they were at on this journey. Um, People were either not started at that level one, at level two, and then a few getting into level three. I think we had like one respondent that was at this level four, which is the next, and that's where you actually start to get to chatbots handling level one type thing. And so you actually start to drive some of the interaction without hitting your humans. The goal is not to replace the humans. The goal is to get the humans working on higher value tasks, automate the lower value functions, the things that are purely transactional.
Yeah.
um, and then level five, which is in what I've seen so far, the only companies that I've seen that are really able to execute on this today are ones, often they're B2C. They maybe SaaS, like B2C SaaS, some B2B, like vertical specific SaaS, but ones that are born in the cloud. And the whole concept there goes back to some of those trends that I was talking about around really transforming your contact center into a revenue driving sort of function, and that's
Yeah.
mostly driven by like deep analytics. And the reason the born in the cloud piece is important is because all the data that drives those analytics is hard to access in most mature companies with a lot of technical debt. And so it
Yeah.
really takes time to get to that stage 5. And it's really, as everybody says in the AI space, is all about the data and how to access it and where it's at and how it's structured. It's really hard to do that if you're not born in the cloud. So
Yeah, if it's not indexed correctly, or not in a way that's you can get that kind of context or build those vector databases. Um, do you also think there's an element, and I'll take maybe a slightly different, because I think my normal come from would be like, oh, like technology, right? Technology. But I also think, is there an element of culture to this, right? From the company, from the executive team, that looks at this as like, they have this vision or this belief, um, that carries the company through the execution of how to implement and get this thing running.
yeah, 100%. I mean, you you have to have a technology first culture to see these things be really impactful. Is what I'm seeing. It's interesting. There's another vet out in the space. He's been out a little bit longer than us. His name is Joel Neeb, I think, but he goes by Thor. We'll have to double check that. We'll have to double check his name there, Josh, or cut that out if I got it wrong. But Nick and I were talking to him, maybe a month ago, and he's he's out talking about what he's calling the insight age, which is essentially where he believes we're at right now. He's been like very successful as a consultant and kind of strategist in the space, and it was interesting because we're a little bit more, I would say, like in the trenches of this stuff within companies, and he's spending almost all of his time talking to boards, talking to CEOs, and he's not talking about any of the details around the technology that we're talking about. He's
Yeah.
talking about that piece you're talking about. It is this forward leaning kind of culture of technology first and of insights and the value in these deep analytics. And I think it's easy to skip past that sometimes and focus on the technology. I think the reality is, like, you can be a really great technologist, and if you're inside of a company that doesn't have that sort of culture, you're like, is it Sisyphus? He's like forever pushing the rock uphill, right? Like it's that sort of thing, and so
Yeah.
it is
It,
really important.
it does feel like it's a mindset and how you look at it as an asset, or an investment, because I think, kind of draw two parallels, or different ones, where you have companies that look at it as this kind of transactional thing because everybody else is doing it, so they're like, all right, yeah, we'll implement that technology, but they're looking at it from just purely more of a transactional mindset, or to drive a little bit of cost savings. And it's like, yes, like that's part of it, right, and a very important part. But there's also an investment in productivity. There's an investment in quality of your your product or your service. um, and I'll give you an anecdote that happened to me and another individual. Gosh, I think it was this week or last week, where, without knowing, I'm pretty sure, that this the AI, like what this unlocked, right, that would have not happened in a normal kind of legacy contact center. So an individual was using a call center for some stuff, and had a pretty negative experience. So they roped me in, and so then we're both dealing with it, and then kind of walked away really frustrated, and then had a negative perspective, not just with that interaction, but with that entire organization. Um, then within 24 hours, we both got contacted by another individual who proactively had reached out and said, like, hey, we want to just say, like, we're sorry about that interaction, like, we're taking blah 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 steps, like, we want to make this thing right. And I talked to the other. It was like, hey, did you send this thing? Because, like, I had meant to, in the heat of the moment, it was like, oh, I'm gonna escalate or whatever, but never actually did anything about it. And so then I was like, well, maybe they did, and none of that had happened. And so somehow they, having that quality assurance where people are reviewing those things, gets proactively escalated, and then all of a sudden you can fix those customer interactions, and then both of us walked away with actually a really positive perspective on that interaction. We're like, hey, you know what? People have off days. People, whatever. Like we all have it. But the fact that that organization had proactively reached out to make it right and had the systems in place to be able to do that, is super empowering, and kind of unlocks a new level of customer service that, like, you take that whatever kind of legacy side that never happens. We're both angry at this organization, and we're not going to use, we're not going to use that service. To flip side, because of those systems, now we're like, oh wow, like this is a great system, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple pieces at play there. Like, I think first and foremost, the impact of a negative experience now. Like, you're not the type of person to do it that I've ever seen. I've known you a long time, but like, you could be out there shouting about that in the public forum, right?
Yep.
And whatever that is, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, a private network of your peers that care about that, you know, company. Like, it could be anywhere, right? And so the consumer has a lot more powerful voice, and so that's one kind of uh, you know thing that's occurring in the space that companies have to consider. The second is the other thing that comes up for me while you're talking about it. Like, flip back to this AI maturity model, kind of the slide I used to go through what I was talking about. And I would say, like, that company is probably in this level 2 or even 3 out of 5, like, which means that they've probably laid some decent groundwork. One I was looking at it in one of the bullet points: support supervisor in their decision making and agent evaluation, e.g., sentiment analysis and trend analysis to identify calls for follow up. Right, like, that's exactly what happened. Right,
Yep.
it was surfaced up, and it's like, hey, this was actually a really negative call, but we can reach out. Like, it's not gone. Like, and in fact, you know, sometimes like, just human psychology works in a way where you we generally accept that people make mistakes, right?
Yep.
And when they actually lean in and they try to resolve it, whether it's the individual or the brand or the company via the supervisor, like, there's actually almost more loyalty that can be born out of that. And
Yeah, and
so,
that
yeah.
and that's how it felt, right? Was and you got to think about, I am sure that the interaction that I had, and that, like, that's it. I'm gonna escalate this thing, but then, you go about your day and you kind of cool down. Now, inside, like, I'm still not happy with that organization. I still have a negative sentiment, but it's not to the point where I think I'm going to do anything about it. Those are the customers that, as an, on the other
Yeah,
side, right?
yeah,
As a person that you're losing and you don't even know it, versus they were able to capture that. And then, because, like, all of a sudden it was like, well, I didn't even have to reach out, right? Like, they took account. It felt like, oh, they're taking accountability, of their product and their service, and proactively reaching out to me. Because even if it was one of those instances where, I had a negative experience, I escalated it and they resolved it, I'd still kind of walk away like, yeah, but I had to climb the ladder to get somebody to help me. Like, I didn't have to do any of that. They proactively reached out. Like, that totally flipped my entire sentiment of that.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It goes back to some of that MarTech stuff I was talking about, and like, even the way people think about marketing and what you're describing right now. There's this concept in marketing, um, around, it's a high level segmentation of your customers, essentially, or even the market in general. And if you're thinking about a spectrum, let's say 0 is in the middle, and you've got people who are indifferent. There's no opinion towards you. A -1 would be like, slight detractor. -2 would be like massive detractor. Um, +1 is like light support or light champion, and then a +2 is a champion, right? So you can kind of visualize that. A lot of companies or people who aren't marketers, what they think about is they think, I've got to go attack those negatives and turn them and move them over here, right? But marketers actually tend to think, okay, how do I go to that +1 and get them to a +2? Or if I have a champion, how do I make sure they don't fall down? right? In this case, presumably you were some version of a champion. You fell into that +1, likely would have ended up towards indifferent or other without some guardrails. The technology worked in this case. It said, hey, we lost here. Let's get them back up to a +1. Let's you know go do the processes that we know we need to do. Because what didn't happen was it wasn't an automated system that then called you, right? Like
Nope.
it could be that one day, like they could dial it in and it could be good enough that could get there, but it was automated scoring, which then generated a process where an individual called you. And so when you talk about those really high value functions and trying to get, you know, your people focused on those high value functions, like this is the technology working exactly how it should.
Yep.
And so that's a cool example. We didn't even talk about that ahead of time. It wasn't enough that you hit me up and you were like, "Man, these people." But
No,
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 cool,
and it all happened, and again because of some of that technology, it all happened within a relatively compressed time frame. It wasn't a month later, it was
super
within a
important.
day. You
Super
know,
important, right? The timing on that. And look, that goes back to, look, any of these things, it's people, process, technology. That's all three of those things working together. The technology kind of alerted it, it indicated a process which worked quickly enough, right? And then the people called and had whatever conversation they needed to have with you.
yep.
So, very cool.
Worked really well. And you could dive into all the different aspects of it where because one of the other things as a consumer, when even if you do get a call from a supervisor or somebody else, but they're not actually spun up on your situation, that's actually
Oh,
really,
worst.
that's frustrating. You're like, so you're calling me, but you don't even know what you're calling me about. Again, like this technology was, took hours or whatever worth of data, was able to, I'm assuming, sum it up, hand it to that, supervisor. Because I also understand the other side of that, right? As a supervisor, like, it what happened over course of hours or a course of days or things like that. Now you're trying to get caught up, and you've probably managing a large team, and this is all happening throughout the day. It's like, what are you gonna you're gonna replicate hours worth of reading? You need the wave tops, and this is allows for that to happen. But then on the other side, as the consumer, what I felt was like, wow, like this person took the time to get spun up on my situation, understands, and then therefore comes with a solution or a recommendation versus like, who are you and what do you want?
Yeah.
Totally
Yeah.
different experience.
Very cool.
Yep.
Man, thanks for kind of having that hip
Yep.
pocket. Worked out decent. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed.